Hello, welcome to week 2 class on the ancient Near East. You want to go ahead and start this presentation by watching those two videos that are, they'll be linked in the YouTube playlist. These are both demonstrations of contemporary iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, or an act of iconoclasm, is the destruction of images or hostility toward visual representation in general, usually with a political or religious motivation. In both of these, you see terrorists in the Middle East. The second one, the Guardian, the destroying the ancient artifacts in the Mosul Museum. That is a videotape that ISIS took and put out on the internet because they believe that any representation of idols goes against their religion and therefore needs to be destroyed. This is not, iconoclasm is not purely a something that Middle Eastern terrorists do, but this has happened throughout history in all parts of the world. The biggest iconoclasm that we will talk about in this class are the iconoclastic riots that happened by the Protestant church, or by the Protestants, during the 1500s, and that was in Germany and Switzerland mostly. So while we go through really any art of non-Western cultures, but especially in the Middle East, think about the dilemma that faces many, especially recently, Egypt, North Africa, and the Middle East, especially Iraq, Iran, and now certainly Syria. The dilemma that faces museums and these civilizations as to what to do with their historical culture and artifacts. Is it safer to move? A lot of proponents, especially those in the West, argue that it's safer to move these priceless artifacts out of these countries into quote-unquote safer countries like Britain, France, the West, the United States. However, Turkey, Greece, even Italy, maybe Syria, Egypt, these countries argue that no, these works are their cultures and they should stay within the country. So just think about that. There are two very valid sides to the argument, and think about that as we go through, because as we will see, something that was destroyed in one of those videos we actually look at later. Alright, so the ancient Near East. The Near East is actually what we usually today consider the Middle East. This area is known as the Fertile Crescent and the cradle of civilization. Mesopotamia, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which is in modern-day Iraq, as you can see here on this map, is often referred to as the cradle of civilization because it is the first place where complex urban centers grew. This part of the world was first excavated in the 19th century, or the 1800s, by French and English archaeologists looking for proof of the Bible. It's the cities mentioned in the Bible, like Nineveh and Babylon, that so inspired the Christian West to dig up the Middle East. The French and the British have the largest collections of ancient Near East artifacts outside of Iraq, Iran, and Egypt. The civilizations in Mesopotamia used the rivers that flow through the desert to create irrigation systems, which then supported extensive farming. This is how complex urban centers were able to develop and sprawl. Many of these urban centers were called city-states and operated independently. That is, until larger government was formed and merged cities and the land in between these cities together. Each of these were protected by their own deities, or groups of deities. The Sumerians rose up out of a collection of city-states that developed along the rivers in southern Mesopotamia. This was collectively called Sumer. Their greatest contribution to civilization is probably the written word, which was originally developed to keep temple records of how many goods were going in and out of the temple. Ziggurats. Ziggurats may have developed from the practice of rescuing sacred sites, continuous building and piling on top of an already present sacred mound or shrine, like the earthworks of the Native Americans nearby here in Ohio. Ziggurats represent wealth, prestige, and stability of the city's rulers and glorify their gods. These would have absolutely towered in desert landscapes. Here's an excavation photograph from Uruk, or present-day Warqa, Iraq, where two large temple complexes were found. One to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and the other to Anu, the sky god. Here's a reconstruction of these temples. Notice how gleaming white the facades would be, and that they're in a long vertical formation. The interiors would have been rather dark. And here's a picture of it today in Iraq. This is a carved vessel found at Uruk. It demonstrates a remarkable amount of clarity to be carved into stone. What do you see? Sources of life in the natural world, beginning with water and plants, continuing with sheep. They march on a solid ground line. The second register, what do we see? It appears that there are naked men carrying baskets of foodstuffs. In the top register, we see the goddess Inanna. She's accepting an offering from two standing figures. So what do you think this vessel means in its entirety? We think that it's depicting all the stages of life in registers. Votive figures. Votive figures are dedicated to the gods and possibly stood in for the human patrons who paid to have them carved. These have inlaid eyes that are very delicate with very beautiful alabaster stone. These votive figures are representations of the patron, so that the patron is always shown in humble piety worshiping the gods. For instance, if you're a wealthy patron and you don't want to spend all of your time at your temple or your chapel, you can have these votive figures stand in for you so that you are constantly praying and worshiping to your gods. This is something we will see repeatedly across cultures, like in Nigeria, and especially throughout the European Renaissance. What do you notice about the figure's elements? Why do you think they look like this, knowing their probable purpose? I see a sense of attentiveness to the sculpture, to the god in the temple where he lived. There's a timelessness. It's not meant to be a personal portrait. He's supposed to be a good worshiper, not a naturalistic figure. He's static, eternal. Writing! Temple officials needed to keep records of the grain, sheep, and cattle entering or leaving their stores and farms, and it became impossible to rely on memory. So, an alternative method was required, and the very earliest texts were pictures of the items scribes needed to record. These are known as pictographs. These were drawn on damp clay tablets, generally read from top to bottom, right to left. Cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, and that you can see in the little wedged-shaped markings on the right-hand picture. And that was the second earliest form of writing after pictographs. This tablet, recording the allocation of beer that was leaving or entering the temple, is from 3100 BCE. The Library of Ashurbanipal is the oldest surviving royal library in the world, with over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, which helped later historians translate cuneiform. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Flood Tablet were both found in this library. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first literary epic. There are various versions across Sumeria, and they tell of a legendary king of Uruk who searches for immortality. The Flood Tablet basically tells a version of the Old Testament story of Noah and the Great Flood. It was discovered by the British and later translated at the British Museum in 1972. A cylinder seal is a small pierced object like a long round bead, carved in reverse or intaglio, and hung on strings of fiber or leather. These often beautiful objects were ubiquitous in the ancient Near East and remain a unique record of individuals from this era. Each seal was owned by one person and was used and held by them in particularly intimate ways, such as strung on a necklace or bracelet. This would be used like a signature. Iconography. These seals contain immense amounts of iconography, so those who needed to could understand the message that was being conveyed and who the seal belonged to. The seals would be rolled into wet clay and would work like a signature. The Akkadian Empire was begun by Sargon, a man from a lowly family who rose to power and founded the royal city of Akkad. Akkad has not yet been located, though one theory puts it under modern Baghdad. This covered most of Mesopotamia. During this period, art becomes an expression of military might. This is one of the earliest known works of lost wax casting. We call it Head of a Man. This is possibly Sargon, and it was once identified as such. What do you see? As far as the style goes here, we can say that this sculpture is symmetrical, idealistic, stoic. We also notice that its eyes and ears are missing. It was mutilated in antiquity. This was an act of iconoclasm, probably by a ruler's forces that came after and wanted to destroy the image of the pre-existing government. This ruler, possibly Sargon, can now no longer hear or see. He is rendered completely powerless. The Stila of Naram Sin is full of symbolic language. What story is told and how do you know? How does this large work break with tradition that we've seen so far? What do we see here? These are soldiers. Notice that it's not a flat or exact register. Notice that there are also trees. Who is this man? This is probably the king. In fact, we know it's the king. How do you know that? He's much bigger than all of the other characters. He also has horns. Notice that there is also a mountain and two suns. So in the Stila of Naram Sin, we see symbolic language. This recalls an actual event, but is not a naturalistic representation of life. This is composite imagery, meaning that we can see the side, the front, and sometimes even the back of individual people. It's a composite of the body rather than one realistic angle. Notice that it's no longer formatted in a register, the 1, 2, 3 stripes that we saw on the vase earlier. There's also a hierarchy of scale. Remember that the king is shown nearly twice the size of the everyday soldiers. And the ruler also has divine attributes, the crown with the horns, and the staff that he holds. The Stila of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon, and he had extremely strict laws, eye for an eye type stuff, based on class, but it was a regulated law code instead of just however the officials felt. This was the first law code of its kind. The top of the stela shows King Hammurabi with the god Shamash. Which figure here is the king? And which figure here is the god? How can you tell? What symbols do you see? The man standing is King Hammurabi. The person sitting is the god Shamash. The god wears a ring. He has a staff. The horns and lightning bolts all represent divinity. And he's sitting, which is a sign of respect, to the standing Hammurabi. We're fast forwarding 1,000 years to talk about Neo-Babylon, or Neo-Babylonia. Neo is Greek or Latin for new. King Nebuchadnezzar is the most famous king of Babylon. This is when Babylon is rebuilt. The Ishtar Gate and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon both hail from this period. It is called Neo-Babylonia because they make Babylon great again after the Assyrian reign in the intermittent 1,000 years. Nebuchadnezzar is a very bad dude in the Bible. He exiles the Jews, and another Babylonian king is probably the guy responsible for the biblical Tower of Babel. The Ishtar Gate is part of the processional way which led a person along the Euphrates through various temples and religious spots honoring the patron god of Babylon, Marduk. This is the ceremonial entrance to Babylon. The Ishtar Gate is big. It's crenellated at the top, which means notched. This is for defensive purposes. Here's a digital reconstruction of the gate. Imagine it in the hot, bright sun. The blue enamel would have shone marvelously, and the gold would have twinkled. Nebuchadnezzar himself had an inscription placed on it, dedicating it to his city and to his gods, with him very much present. The entire gate is covered in beautiful blue and gold inlaid enamel. There are dragons, which are Marduk's patron animal, lions, which represent King Nebuchadnezzar, and cattle, which represent prosperity for Babylonia. Okay, now rewind 1,000 years. We're going to the Assyrian Empire, which dominated Mesopotamia and all of the Near East for the first half of the first millennium, led by a series of highly ambitious and aggressive warrior kings. It was brutal. Once conquered, the enemies were tortured, raped, beheaded, and flayed with their corpses publicly displayed. The Assyrians torched enemies' houses, salted their fields, and cut down their orchards. All the absolute power and resources they gained through these intense methods, however, led to excessively luxurious palaces with halls on halls for banquets, filled with reliefs and sculptures. Go ahead and take a look at this video, which walks you through an ancient Assyrian palace. Guardian figures guard various entrances to the palaces in Assyria. This is an older pair in modern-day Turkey. They are colossal in size. These guardian figures are known as imases. They are combined bearded head of man and the powerful body of a lion or bull with the wings of an eagle and the horned headdress of a god. These were probably painted. Notice the man standing next to the one on the right. These are colossal figures. These are also the ones that the British fellow was checking in on at the Baghdad Museum. The heart of ancient Persia is what is now southwest Iran, in the region called the Fars. In the second half of the 6th century BCE, the Persians, also known as the Achaemenians, created an enormous empire reaching from the Indus Valley to northern Greece and from Central Asia to Egypt. If you have any desire to learn about Persia and modern-day Iran, The Complete Persepolis is an excellent graphic novel on that topic. Persia was a tolerant, multi-ethnic empire founded by Darius the Great. This is the Gate of Nations at Darius' palace in Persepolis. The Persians must have been very proud of their all-inclusive approach to empire, as can be seen in the representation of the many peoples in the reliefs from Persepolis, a city founded by Darius the Great in the 6th century BCE. Darius imported materials, workers, and styles from all over the empire, including Persian, Median, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek.